Welcome to the Up Arrow Podcast with William Harris, featuring top business leaders sharing strategies and resources to get to the next level. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hey everyone, I'm William Harris. I'm the founder and CEO of Element and the host of the Up Arrow Podcast, where I feature the best minds in e-commerce to help you scale from 10 million to 100 million and beyond as you up arrow your business and your personal life. Today's episode is a freaking masterclass in modern marketing, served up by two of the most brilliant and battle-tested minds in the growth world. These aren't guys who talk just about theory. They've shaped the strategies behind some of the most explosive growth stories in tech, media, and consumer brands. First up, Christian Limon, previous guest on the podcast and dare I say friend. He's led mobile growth for some incredible companies, including Wish.com, Tubi, and Gemini. He's also one of the most sought-after growth advisors in the space, known for cutting through the noise and bringing clarity to chaos. And alongside him, Eric Seufert. Eric is the founder and general partner at Heracles Capital and was the mad scientist who helped grow Angry Birds. He's one of the sharpest economic thinkers in digital advertising. If you've read his work, you know he's the guy who called the post-IDFA world before most marketers even knew what a privacy framework was. His writing has reshaped how the industry thinks about attribution, platform power, and performance marketing. Today, we're diving deep into what I like to call growth myths, those things we say, share, and optimize for in modern marketing that might not actually be true. We'll cover why being data-driven might be the most dangerous myth in your marketing strategy, what AI is actually good at and where marketers are getting it wildly wrong, why your attribution model is probably lying to you, and whether the next evolution of growth will require more math, creativity, or philosophy. And yes, this conversation might get a little nerdy. We might reference Plato or even the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, but don't worry, we'll talk about how to actually grow your business faster, smarter, and with fewer blind spots. So buckle up, this is going to be a fun, fast, and frankly essential ride through the myths and truths that define modern growth. Christian and Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, great to be here.
Cool. I'll give a quick shout out to our sponsor and then we'll dig right in here. This episode is brought to you by Element. Element is an award-winning advertising agency optimizing e-commerce campaigns around profit. In fact, we've helped 13 of our customers get acquired, with the largest one selling for nearly $800 million and one that IPO'd. You can learn more on our website at element.com, which is spelled ELUMYNT.com. That said, on to the good stuff. I want to start off with the illusion of being data-driven. So my first question is for Eric here. In Christian's podcast appearance here, he mentioned that being data-driven is often a myth. I loved it. It's a really good take. Similarly, Eric, in your article, yes, some metrics are fake, but performance marketers don't care. You discussed the prevalence of misleading metrics in performance marketing. How can marketers discern between meaningful data from vanity metrics in today's landscape?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when I wrote that piece, that was a guest piece that I wrote for Ad Exchanger. And the reason I wrote it was that there had been this kind of viral thread on Twitter that was basically making the case that you essentially can't trust any metrics that you get from ad platforms, like essentially sure. Making the claim that like everything is falsified or everything is misrepresented or mischaracterized or just utterly fraudulent. And I was saying like, yeah, sure, of course that's the case. That fraud exists. That not everything you buy has value, right? But ultimately, like if you're a performance marketer, that's not. That in and of itself shouldn't scare you away from
sure.
doing marketing. Like, I don't really know what the alternative is. Just throwing your hands up and saying, well, I guess we're never going to market anything again. sure. The point I was making there was like, if you can discern value from waste, you can optimize your campaign spend. You may not be able to trust all the intermediary metrics all the time, but like if you can build a framework to do measurement, like fundamentally do measurement, then you can sort of tune your ad spend. And if you're if you are doing it in such a way that you are sort of like demonstrably producing workable, profitable ROAS, return on ad spend, then okay, if there's some wastage, there's some slippage, whatever, like that's unfortunate, but ultimately your marketing activities are delivering more value than they cost, right? And so that was the point there. But I think like, where people get hung up, I mean, so there are a couple things that can happen that can sort of derail a marketing org, right? One is just bad incentives, right? And you've seen this historically with like famous cases like that of Uber, right? So like, you may not be familiar with this. I want to say it's like 2019, 2020. Uber sued a bunch of the agencies it was working with.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, what was that, Christian?
Is it Fixu?
It was a number of them. It was more than no. They sued their agent. There was one agency that they sued. It might have been more than one, but then they settled with them and then sued the demand channels that the agencies were buying from.
Yeah.
And the thing was though, like they had a chart that showed ad spend and then like new registrations, right? It's like 2 lines. And then they thought that like, okay, well, this ad spend is not effective, right? This ad spend is not incremental. And then they cut the ad spend. So you see the ad spend line just dropped to basically 0. And the new registration line stayed the same. And the new registration line was composed of paid and organic registrations, right? And so like you saw, okay, well, when they cut spend, the paid registrations line went to 0 and the organics just went to the same level as the previous total, right? And so essentially they were buying users that would have downloaded the app anyway. And it turned out that there was an incentive problem. They had an intermediary that was doing the traffic acquisition, right? These agencies, and they were buying from channels that I think, and I made this point at the time, they should have known were probably not delivering legitimate high quality traffic. But everyone's incentives there were broken, right? You had the people in the marketing team who were just paying the agency that had this line that looked like it was delivering profitable metrics. They were not really incentivized to dig deeper. You had the agency that's getting paid on a percentage of media basis, who's not really incentivized to dig deeper, because if they discover fraud, it's going to reduce the amount of money they're spending. It's going to reduce their cut. And so you just had like bad incentives throughout that system. So like that's one way that your marketing can just be broken. You just have bad incentives. The other way is to just like not really orient it around commercial outcomes, right? Is to think that like any given point along the funnel is as valuable as any other, right? And so then you're doing cost per click, or you're doing even CPM buying, or you're doing cost per registration, or all these kind of things. And the reality is that each of those has a different value, and they have a different sort of like they possess a different sort of amount of conversion potential to the thing that you actually do care about, which is a purchase. And then there's all different ways to like manipulate LTV metrics, to project them out too far, to calculate ROAS on too long of a timeline. And so like, I think the way to fix that is to just orient everyone around true commercial outcomes, right? And to make sure that when you're modeling things, that they're reflective of reality and sort of everyone is aligned around what that reality is.
I want to give Christian a chance on this, but I want to say this real quick. I said this on Kurt Elster's podcast, the Unofficial Shopify podcast. I want to do it with you guys too. Do you like cake? Do you enjoy cake?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Do you like real cake as much or more than you like a picture of a cake?
Probably more. Yeah.
Right. For the simple reason that it exists, right? Like to a point, like there's a benefit to it existing in the world being better than just this picture of it. That's kind of how I looked at ROAS. And one of the biggest reasons why we talk about, even at the beginning, talking about optimizing towards EBITDA being a big part of how we focus things. ROAS is completely made up. It's a made up number that doesn't really exist within the ads platform is the way that I see it. Because that depends on, well, what kind of data you're bringing in and out of this. That could just be based on like their way of how they're calculating attribution. There's a lot of ways in which it's not actually the real return that you have from that ad spend. And so that's where, to your point, we align towards how do we make sure that what we're doing is driving towards EBITDA. If I don't have a client that's willing to at least share something that's analogous to their P&L with me, there's the likelihood of me being able to align to their actual goal goes down significantly because I'm not going to hit that real goal. Christian, you've done this significantly at wish.com, I know especially, but as well as others, Tubi, et cetera. But like, I remember there was a campaign that we talked about that you did with, the Lakers. And it's like, well, how do you measure the attribution of what this is? But like, what do you think about what Eric's saying here?
He said a lot. I think there's nothing he said that's wrong. I think a lot of it is like nuance lost in. I think there's like a almost like a segment of folks who would prefer the world to be like a lot simpler or like 2-dimensional as opposed to like 8-dimensional. And a lot of the arguments underpinning all of them will be something related to like a binary argument or is this valuable or not, as opposed to really I'll track like 30 metrics or 20 metrics, and there's a hierarchy to them, and the highest one is like profit, and then in revenue and paying users, and but doesn't mean that that's what you want to necessarily buy, because that might be the most expensive way to acquire that. So there's like a lot of strategy and mechanics to figuring out how to make it profitable, and how to like scale it without impacting cost too much.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I have recognized is that a lot of times it's easy to point the finger at the agency. At least I run an agency, a little bit biased here. But more often than not, Eric, kind of what you called out is that even the internal marketing team usually doesn't even know whether or not what they were doing was driving towards profitability or not. They are also given, oftentimes a goal that maybe wasn't as deeply tied to the knowledge of how effective or impactful this was to the business. So
to be fair to Uber, so one, the person who was doing performance marketing, like he had been in gaming before, he knew that the web is all fraud, basically, the way he was buying it, or he should have known. But Uber is one of the only companies that's ever been in a race, where like the time component was very valuable, where they were in a race to like capture a lot of the US, in a race in China, and they were basically like paying to speed things up. I don't know if that's how they actually justified it, but I would assume. I've never been in a situation, I feel like, where like they were requiring putting a premium on time to that degree.
Eric, who's responsible in a situation like this? Like, is it
CEO.
Leadership?
Well, yeah, I mean, everyone, I would say, but yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. Like they're putting a premium on speed for sure. And to be clear, like I don't have any details about the incentives that were made available within the team. All I know is what I read in the
Sure.
filing, the court filing. I imagine that was the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they did investigate it internally, right? Obviously. But yeah, I mean, like I think when you're spending those sums of money, I mean, this is an imperative that starts at the very top. I mean, I think the CEO should get updates on like, this is like the sort of like ROAS profile of our ad spend. And the thing like that I find really interesting is, a lot of digital first businesses, they don't really see marketing as like this critically structural component to their business, right? Like they know that they need it. They need it to as an influx of revenue. But like you might have a management team that's like totally divorced from the mechanics of doing, performance acquisition.
Yeah.
Like, and at that scale, that is your business. That's essentially the entirety of your business, right? Like if you cut it off, the effective UA that you're doing, the effective performance marketing, the effective customer acquisition, if you cut that off, your revenue is going to go to zero. Your new customer acquisition will go to zero, right? And it's also like generally the largest line item expense for the company. And so like just it's weird that there is a gap there, like a knowledge gap or a domain expertise gap. Now I'm not saying that like the CEO of a very large digital first company should know how to, what the different types of bidding on Facebook. That's too low altitude, but they should understand like the mechanics in terms of like how this money that we spend flows through into a P&L, and understand like where they can identify red flags there, and they should be sort of like regularly auditing that and working in partnership with like the CMO or the marketing leadership to do that on like a very sort of like kind of quick turnaround basis.
So this is where I feel like the Plato's allegory of the cave comes up, right? This idea that it's like we're looking at shadows, we're chasing shadows versus the real thing. How can leadership CEOs have the knowledge you're looking for? An example would be geo-holdouts. I love geo-holdouts. But do you think they're good, or do you think it's too slow? Especially if you're, a company like Uber, you're trying to move fast. Is it effective to be able to get that incrementality, or no?
The nice thing about having that many resources also at Uber is they don't have to do things sequentially. They can do everything in parallel.
Totally.
all at the
That's
same
true.
time.
Yeah.
So they could do geo holdouts as well as everything else.
That's fair. Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Geo holdouts are a tool, right? I mean,
Mhm.
they, there's, and like the sort of effectiveness is context dependent.
Mhm.
I think like if you were a company that was very quickly acquiring market share, geo holdouts might not be effective in certain cases, right? Because first of all,
You
you're
still have to-
probably
what
predominantly investing in the US. So what do you hold out on? Right.
Yeah.
Now you could do state level holdouts, but those are a lot harder to instrument, right? And then, there is an opportunity cost there, right? So like, let's say, okay, well, like let's turn off UA or customer acquisition in the US to see what happens. Well, if I'm growing extremely quickly and I have a competitor nipping at my heels, that's going to be a very difficult proposition to sell to your CEO. We're going to cut off ad spend in the most important country just to measure the incremental effect, right? And if you are disproportionately investing in the United States, well, then if you go and cut it off somewhere else to see the incremental uplift there, it's not really that reflective of maybe what's happening in the biggest, most important geo, right? So like,
Sure.
you have to do this kind of experimentation. It's really important. I think geo holdouts they're a very effective tool in a lot of cases. But you also have to kind of consider the context, and you have to come up with like bespoke solutions that match the situation.
Yeah, and they don't tell you what or like why things change. They show you that there is some type of change likely, and ideally you designed it in a way so that whatever you structured in there and baked in there was different. Tells you something, but it's what you see is like some type of outcome, not a like second order like rationale as to like why everything was different or why XYZ chose something else.
So I really like diagnostic action as one of my favorite ways to do something. You go to the doctor and the doctor says 80% of the time that you have these symptoms, you have this thing, take this medicine. If you have it, I was right. Like if you get better, then I was right. If you don't get better, then you were fall into this other 20%. But they don't say it that way, but that's essentially what they're doing. Similarly in an ads thing, it's like, well, just do the thing. If things go up, likely you did the right thing. How do you feel about diagnostic action as it relates to growth?
The way I've done things has always been very iterative and slow and controlled, as opposed to anything bursting or any hard on and offs. It takes a little bit because to scale, you need to, it's like I'm optimizing 100 times as opposed to a few times that like moves the needle up and down. It takes much longer, but once you get it there, it's like quite stable and quite healthy, because the in-between points, have, controlled for it. And that actually has like, a lot of benefits to the actual campaign from like not introducing a ton of like volatility and shortening the life cycle of the campaign. That isn't like a fact, but I've observed that as from like super durable 2-year campaigns being live as opposed to other people's like 1 month campaigns or month and a half.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to have the same approach, right? I mean, you want to try to isolate as much change as you can, and like I kind of have always likened, kind of like modern, like call it in like the last few years, especially like post ATT digital marketing to like managing a Jenga tower, right? I mean, you want to pull one thing out and be just very cautious, and then you pull another thing out, you make a change, you watch, you wait, you sort of like hold your breath. Like I think my approach. And to Christian's point, like this is supposed to be like slow and methodical and systematic, right? It's not supposed to be like frenzied and chaotic. And the more chaotic it is, usually like the less sure you can be of any metrics that you see, right? I mean, you can't just chase short-term volatility all the time. It's too expensive. All of these metrics tend to be like mean reverting. So you need a process, and you need a dependable process, and that means just running it many times and being certain of the results. But I think like what I think is really important, particularly now, is like managing the creative side of things in a way that is very systematic. And that's typically what I see people doing wrong. Like if I, get exposure to an organization where their marketing, is not delivering the results that they would want. It's that there's no real rhyme or reason to the creative. They're just pushing stuff out, and they're pushing a lot of stuff out, and they don't really have a system. They don't have a system for doing analysis. They don't have a system for doing production. They don't really understand what volume of creative produces like reliable results. And that probably is like the single biggest lever. And so it's just like disproportionately focusing on that and building an actual repeatable system usually solves a lot of problems for like digital, especially for like digital first companies, but even just generally with digital marketing.
I like where you're going with this. I want to jump into this creativity side then. So there's one school of thought out there where somebody says, just throw it all, it's the spaghetti against the wall, throw it all into the algorithm and just see what happens. And they're typically saying you need to be testing, 1,000 new ads a week or whatever. They're throwing out some number and they're just saying this, you need to be testing this.
It's still contained by only what you can think of though.
Sure. Okay. So what's the alternative? What's beyond what you can think of?
Is you develop a strategy that takes advantage of more of the search space. Is you find out how to remove yourself from being the limiter of things you've tried. I did that for UGC video. It took me forever to find things that worked because I had to first develop a strategy for how was I going to try things that was like not biased by me and that were different enough from each other and from everything that I've done, including how these groups or people think and what they do for a living. That I wasn't going to be, the 4 of the 6 reasons why why there wasn't a working e-commerce video creative.
So how did you do it? And I'm going to give you a scenario. One of the things that we did.
Instructions.
Say that again. Oh, it didn't give anybody instructions. Just let them do it.
I let them do it. I told them what they wanted to do, and the how. I left it up to them, gave them a budget, but I did the simultaneous approach. And these groups and people weren't necessarily all, they didn't make creative for a living. Some of them, did, apps kind of like a Whatnot and stuff like that, where they, might be able to make creative on the side to like pay for some bills because they have, they're making, a lot of video in-house, or it's like a stand-up comedy type of sketch, something, or a modeling something. But you just try to think about like how different and wide can the search space be, and like how can I make sure I'm covering like very different points that can have like viable signals for like, is this somewhere where the working ad could live?
So I like that. One of the ways that we've tried to get outside of the echo chamber, if you would, of even UGC can start sounding exactly the same too, is giving it to somebody who is not even in your ideal customer profile. And an example that I have is there was a beauty device that we were working on selling. And so we were kind of in a rut and we said, what about something completely outside of it? And I don't remember exact niche that we went after. I think it was like biking, camping type thing. Where it's like, how about a female who's 35 who's more into biking and camping, and then it gave us some completely different things. But let's say
B2B thinks like that a lot, where they're constantly they're thinking about who specifically they want or who they want to exclude, as opposed to just enabling.
Sure. So let's say that you do this though. Let's say that you get 10,000 ads from completely different people. How do you still turn that into a learning experience that you can lean into certain things that are working versus just wasting it? Because in theory, every ad that you test is a little bit of a waste.
Small. It's really not, right? So to get signal on whether something works, that's what you're dependent on is a sample size. Like it isn't dependent on some other like variable. So like regardless, everything that you try, the first learning period, like X conversion amounts, you're going to pay for all of them equally just to find out what the result is. But then from there, it's up to you whether you want to like take it to like $1,000 or increase it by 15%. and it's everyone. It's like everyone else's jumps up. Even small advertisers, they jump up to like really big amounts really quickly.
Yeah, Eric, what do you think? What's your process here?
Well, so I mean, the number of variants. I mean, I think that's probably a vanity metric in
Sure.
a way, right? I mean, unless those variants truly capture fundamentally different ideas. Now you want variants a lot of times because you just want to display, you want to convey some idea, you want to convey some sort of like commercial narrative with different properties, because like those properties might perform better, they might not perform. But like if you're talking about truly optimizing performance, I mean, you kind of have to think about this like a gradient descent problem. Like, the variants are going to like sort of, find like the kind of like local best, the local sort of like maximum. But if you want to find the global maximum, you need to just radically experiment with concepts. And so you might have, you could have 200 variants or 10,000 variants. And if they're all, just capturing the same 3 concepts, you're not really doing experimentation. You're just sort of like modifying variants.
That's what was my critique of the data-driven thing, was that it's still constrained by like what you're allowed to experiment in your organization or your team and your resources or your CEO, or by your brand constraints.
Yeah, or just production constraints, right? And I think but that's the kind of suboptimal workflow that teams get stuck in. It's like, well, okay, we'll just increase the number of variants. So like that just means, okay, instead of making 20 variants for every concept, we're going to make 200 variants for every concept. But you're still conveying the same concepts, right? And the way that you introduce like true difference is with randomness, right? And so you can think about this like as the concept of like temperature and machine learning. You got to turn the temperature up, and you got to get like truly random ideas in there, or just different. And so like a lot of times, there's a couple ways you can sort of engineer that to happen. Yeah. One is just finding different sources of inputs, right? So like you've got a marketing production team. Well, maybe let's get 10 outsourcers and we'll give them sort of like very broad, vague instructions and just see what they come up with, right? And then like we'll cycle through. Let's say we have like this web of influencers, this network of not influencers, of freelancers, and we'll just have we'll cycle through like a different 10 of them every week or something. That's a way to introduce essentially not true randomness, but just like alter the sort of input sources to get different ideas, like different fundamental ideas.
How do you reconcile? So I had a button at Wish, and I would duplicate a lot of campaigns. I would just duplicate them like 100 times, 50 times, something like that. And since the learning period is actually pretty finite, and the campaigns are path dependent, meaning it judges who it finds next based on who it found before, in a decently like finite pool that can be biased with enough of those duplications that we could create or manufacture outliers. Do you think that maybe that was an accident, or how do you like reconcile that piece?
I think that would have been like a really effective strategy, but Advantage Plus. I think now they try to consolidate everything to the point where like they want to engineer that, and I think you wouldn't be able to do that with just a large number of camp. I see the logic, right, and that does make sense. But I think now it's the way they sort of like instituted the consolidation through Advantage Plus. I think it would be hard to do that with just creating a bunch of campaigns. Yeah,
I never understood. So there's do this so that it performs better, and then there's the does it perform better, and we had like 30,000 campaigns, and we never consolidated. And it was our suspicion that like the only rationale that made sense that they could communicate was that they were just annoyed by it, versus the only thing that matters is does this method, can we find a signal that tells us that this method is like works better as far as like the returns.
Was they, being Facebook, they were annoyed that you had so many campaigns? That's a lot of campaigns.
Sure. Well, yeah, but also they couldn't see them because we would buy through the API.
Oh,
okay.
So they were annoyed that basically that they're just like very in the dark.
Yeah.
Or they would be annoyed by just you being an anomaly to a best practice.
So you're the reason why they have ASC, and they decided they wanted to control all of this.
Yeah, I just didn't listen. And then they would like, we would get carved out of like any having to do anything like with UAC was like that for a long time. We just stayed in AdMob for the longest time, or AdWords for a really long time with multiple campaigns instead of the universal app campaign. Just because it's like, if we disrupt everything, do you really want to lose like $500 million?
Sure. You don't want to disrupt something that's working.
Yeah.
Since we can't likely do that as much anymore, like you said, based on ASC, what are other ways that you can inject that randomness? I'll give you an idea of what we do and what I think works very well. But I'd love to know what you guys think about this. Okay, so for testing the different concepts, let me start by pulling back to that. Testing different concepts versus just 200 iterations of the same thing. I do like to look at behavioral science tactics. So I'll just say is this the Zeigarnik effect? Like which thing is it that we're actually testing within this versus just simply saying, oh, all 200 ads that we just tested are the exact same behavioral science tactic. Can we branch out from that as one of the different ways we're looking at this? Even if these were all UGC from 200 different people, they could all be still trying to rely on the same thing, maybe because they watched other people write ads for this or whatever. So how do I break that out? How do I see, I want to test this other concept out, try and do that a little bit more. What I haven't done, but you inspired me just today to try to think through is, on the randomness side, is using maybe ChatGPT to say, okay, maybe I'm going after 30-year-old girls for this particular product, this beauty device. Maybe I say, write an ad as if you're writing this to a 60-year-old male. Like maybe that would also be this idea of like completely different and off script, but just seeing like how can I branch this out beyond what it already thinks it should be writing towards? Good idea? Bad idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good idea. There's actually a lot of research going into using LLMs for hypothesis testing now. There's interesting paper. I'm blanking on the guy's name, but it's actually his job market paper. He just finished his PhD at University of Chicago, and he's looking for like an academic position. And what he wrote about was they used LLMs for hypothesis testing, and they tested them on headlines, right? So there's this this data set, this Upworthy, right? So I don't know if I don't think the website exists anymore. It was Upworthy. They had it was kind of like just like a pop news website, but they A/B tested all of their headlines. And so there's this large data bank of all the headline variants that they tested. And so what this guy did was he fed these into ChatGPT, and he said, like, come up with hypotheses around why these might have worked. And then he consolidated those, like deduped them, and then used those to create new headlines, and then tested those and just to see which ones worked. I think there's a lot of interesting research going into using LLMs to kind of introduce that kind of randomness as like almost like a stochastic mechanism. I think that's really interesting. I mean, I think like, but even if you didn't want to build that kind of framework, I think there's there are ways to just say, look, we need to come up with like totally new things. And, if we just all the same people sit around the same table and say, let's throw some ideas out there, you're probably not going to get that, right? So there's some recognition that like the process that got you to this point is going to continue delivering like very similar results, right? And you have to shake things up in some material way.
How?
I notice a lot of people get stung up on just the concept of they need to test, but test means this specific thing. Like the way you were describing, I need to test this or that, or how the mechanics make it so that it's a test, as opposed to, like spending the, like, why do you want to test, right? Is it to like inform something, or is it to discover, like healthy marketable campaigns? Because if the ultimate goal is marketable campaigns, then you could just like launch everything live small, and that's your test. As long as you don't spend more than you would a test, like whatever you consider to be efficient. That's like
I think there's two surface areas, right? It's not just the ads, it's the product. And so, we were talking about like, well, creative is a very powerful lever for driving performance, but if you can actually make the product work better, the same performance on the creative side and the click side on the top of the funnel that could actually, would deliver better ROAS, right? So they have two surface areas that you can sort of you can optimize not simultaneously, but like in a kind of back and forth process to get to like the sort of optimal point. And so some of those things could be just introducing radical variation to the product itself, right? And if you can just get people to check out at a higher rate, I mean, this is also like really easy to do on the web. That's one advantage that you have when you're doing sort of like any sort of like web-based marketing. It's like, well, you're pushing something to a website. You can introduce variations to like a checkout, right, process or a registration process really easily in a website.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like a CMO's nightmare. A like variance introduced into their site or into the brand. Like I think they get variance would be like a negative within them, or they would want to say, okay, variance, but within this. But then when you really look at what this is, it's like quite tight.
I mean, this is very similar to what what's the name is doing, Sheen, right? I mean, it's just, they're literally just testing product.
Yeah.
Who?
Sheen.
Tamo too.
Yeah, right. They're just testing product just to get it out, as many different types of products out there. I mean, they're not testing variants on that product, but in essence, they are.
Yeah, right. It's just it's a variant of the same school as like a Wish, which is just more is more of everything. You know, more is better.
When you're
if you're going to do one of those strategies, like the stuff that I talk about, is you either commit to that extreme, or it doesn't work.
Sure, it's not going to work if you have one product, kind of thing, as well as if you have many products.
Well, that doesn't work for a number of reasons. Like, for mechanically, for one creative works a lot like worse than say, dynamic, like a 40,000 SKU creative. Mm-hmm. But also TAM wise.
Yeah. When you talked about making the product better, Eric, where my mind went was not like the idea of like Wish or Temu or whatever, right? Like where you're testing out significantly different products. I mean, even though they're iterations of those products, it doesn't feel like you're testing out like an improvement to the product as much as just different versions. Yeah. Where my mind went was like, let's say you have product A and you maybe only have 5 products. You just, this is your niche, this is what you have your product. And you're testing out, how do I make that product better? So in my mind, I was looking at it from that perspective. So it's less of an acquisition play now. To me, that sounds like something that you would see more on the LTV than you would on the CAC, right? Like in theory, then you have people sticking around longer. They're referring people. You're decreasing CAC because of word of mouth, but the actual advertising CAC might not change from that. But you would see that on an LTV because more people are sticking around. They're buying more often, et cetera.
Yeah, but the LTV goes up, the ROAS goes up. So this is all marketing.
Sure.
Like I don't distinguish between these two tactics, right? So like, but I'm not necessarily talking about like, let's make the product pink. We sell soccer shoes and they're going to be pink with like, red stripes, but for like changing the actual fundamental product. I'm talking about more like the customer journey, right? And so just like finding ways to optimize that. But like if you're talking about digital products, I mean, everything can be dynamic. I mean, like dynamic pricing. There's the registration flow, like all of this stuff can be dynamic. And so I'm talking more about like, optimizing that flow. And in so doing, the advertising is more efficient and therefore your ROAS is better. And then probably you're increasing your bids. And like this is just this endless cycle. I mean, that's the job, right? It's like this constant recurrence of optimization, increased bids, grow spend, and then on and on.
What do you tell folks with like smaller sample sizes or smaller, target audience where they can't iterate as quickly because they don't have that much volume? Like B2B's in this boat.
Yeah, well, then that's just a constraint, right? I mean, you just gotta you can't have. You're talking like kind of very slow, sequential building up enough sample, making really big changes, right? Like it's not. Well, I'm going to change the ordering of the checkbox. Like that's not, if you have 1 million registrations a day, okay, that might tell you something. You'd have to make sort of like big, bold, conceptual changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How, when we think about this from the perspective of people using AI to optimize and improve these workflows, where do you think AI is best utilized the way it stands today to improve the amount of testing that we're doing and optimizing creativity? Because it's wildly creative, but to your point, if you're not testing something intentionally, like where are the best ways that we could use this? And that could be for either one of them.
You mentioned headlines. That's a good one.
Yeah, headlines.
Right. text things in text.
I think like where I've seen companies, utilize AI to like great effect are just in workflow improvements, right? So like I think a lot of people think like, okay, we're gonna just, replace a lot of the core components of our products with like API calls to ChatGPT, and that's gonna 10x our business. Like this thing that I've been, this I wrote an article a while back, but like it's kind of like a theme that comes up a lot when I talk to companies is like you should look at AI as like an output accelerant, right, or an output magnifier, like, and not something that replaces the actual effort, right? As I've called this, like exoskeletons, not cyborgs, right? Like you want to use AI in ways that like magnify and amplify your efforts, but not that replace them completely. And so like there's a lot of workflow improvements that you can use AI to do. Like for instance, I mean just one that I implemented with the company I work with. We have a tool that just scans all of like chart movements, like top downloaded app. This is an app company, right? All the top downloaded chart movements, looking for the biggest rank jumps, and then going and trying to find those pages on Facebook, and then pulling out the ads from the Facebook ads library, and then surfacing those in Slack. Right. And like that's pretty easy to do with AI agent. Right. But that's still ultimately bringing those to us. And then we're using our human intuition to understand, like, well, why do we think they jump so much? Do we think it's the advertising? And can we learn anything from the advertising? Right. That's still putting the human at the center of that workflow. But it's cutting out a lot of the manual effort that you would need to do to build a process around that without, the AI.
Yeah. I noticed that last mile is where all the error, I think, is like built in, is your interpretation of like why sometimes.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think you even hinted at the idea of last mile. And again, I go back to, for me, I still look at things very differently between CAC and LTV, because to me, when I'm looking at this, especially on the e-commerce side of things, what I do to acquire customers is very different than what I'm going to do to make sure that I continue them being in the company, although they can be different. But I will say that one of the things that I've noticed with a lot of creative testing, let's say that you are testing out, thousands of different creatives, it complicates understanding whether you've acquired the right customer or not. And so when I'm looking at this from an LTV standpoint, and I think
What's
about
the right customer.
Well, okay, so that's where I'll get to. Like the right customer could be maybe one ad creative does a better job of acquiring a certain demographic, and that demographic has, let's say, a $20 CAC, but a $200 LTV. Another one might have a $40 CAC, but a $400 LTV. And so to me, sometimes I might be over optimizing now for the lowest acquisition cost instead of the higher LTV by looking too quickly when I'm doing too many ad creatives.
What time frame are you optimizing towards?
Well, and so that's what I'm saying. So like, I think that, let's just even say
there's only a few variables in this, so it's like quite easy to compare them.
But I think this is let me just say, this is where I think a lot of people forget to look at when they're looking at creative testing, is that they will look at which one is doing a better job immediately. And they're making these decisions, they're making these calls within a week, where they're not seeing what's the impact on that creative at driving the right customers over somebody who has a higher lifetime value. So I would say that like there's the initial analysis, but then there's the later analysis. And I like to go back and revisit some of the creative tests that we did. I like to revisit them 6 months or 12 months down the line to say, did my hypothesis, did my assumption hold true? Yes, it was a better CAC. Can I look at this to say, has that impacted negatively or positively the LTV of those customers?
Yeah, I don't think that there's a like right or wrong. I mean, in B2B, there definitely is. But, when you have a large audience, it's like more on a spectrum. There's only more expensive customers and less expensive customers, and more valuable customers and less valuable customers. Other than that, you're trying to get them as efficiently as possible and make them as happy as possible to spend money. And there is no, also if you call something right or wrong, like you determine that you know why, like that result will like reproduce, or it's projecting a lot more than what is being given to you, which is just this performed XYZ. That's all it told you.
Sure. That's fair. Eric, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, LTV is just such a fraught like topic. I think it's really easy to get wrong, and you do need some, like, where I see companies make mistakes with LTV. It's like they're making all these changes and then they're constantly trying to adapt the model to that, right? And like you essentially have like different data sets. I mean, if you make every sort of like fundamental change you make is you have to kind of throw out a lot of assumptions about how they're going to behave over some amount of time. And it's like the more sort of like volatile the product is or the marketing is, like the sort of shorter the LTV calculation has to be, just by definition, right? Because you're only able to really track these people that are similar in those kind of along those features that were used to target them. So my sense is like you've got to be mindful of that. If you're just sort of like pushing all the data through this LTV model that has been trained on a year's worth of cohorts, but you're making like radical changes to your marketing mix like every day, or your the campaign structure or like the creative you're using, like that LTV model is not really reliable.
I haven't worked somewhere where most of the places that I've ran marketing, the value was more front loaded.
Sure.
And there is like a long-term LTV. There was like a 1.5 to 2 year LTV, but most of the value is like behind you versus in front of you. So even when you're off, you're within a pretty tight range in terms of like where it's going to end up. You're fairly confident, as opposed to there are some products, I guess, where like in the future, it's possible that you will be a really like a zeroed out outcome or a 10x outcome.
That's fair. We have customers that are on the other spectrum, so that's why I bring that up so often. One of them sold, let's say, saltwater fish supplies, and so there was some front load the tank and the setup and whatever, but the lifetime value, I mean, we're talking 3, 4, 5, 6 years later. I memean, it just grew significantly, and we could see that very much in the cohort analyses.
Yeah, 6 years later. Well, it makes sense for some products, but I think Eric is implying that you're messing with the math to make it work for you.
That's fair.
6 years is pretty extreme. I think that's my sense. Like actually, the example that always comes to mind is like Casper. Like, okay, you're buying a mattress. You really gonna buy another one in another year? You know what I mean? Like you might buy the pillowcase, you might buy the pillow, but you're not that LTV is pretty front loaded to like that one purchase, right? And that's like one of the nice things about e-com is a lot of that stuff is pretty front loaded, and you have to. There's common sense here, right? I mean, you could test a bunch of stuff, but like with e-com, I mean, there tends to be like a pretty common sense understanding or delineation between, okay, when this purchase was driven by an ad and when it was driven by the previous purchase. And I think a lot of times it's just driven by the ad. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that brand. I bought some stuff from them 6 months ago. Let me buy another thing. And so then that probably just belongs to that new ad spend. It's not really like long-term value in that sense.
Yeah, that's fair. Let's switch over to platform power and attribution changes. Eric, you have written about the control that Apple and Google exert over advertising attribution. And I might be stretching it a little bit, but to me at least, it feels like the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, where it feels like the more that I know about one thing, the less I seem to know about something else. How does Google and Apple's control over attribution influence marketers' ability to measure and optimize campaigns effectively?
Well, what's funny is I think a lot of that might be reversing course, right? So, I mean, Google just announced 2 days ago that they're not deprecating cookies now, right?
Sure.
They wanted to move everybody onto again. They wanted to move everyone on to Privacy Sandbox, which is not going to be as effective as probably as cookie-based measurement. But that's a attribution methodology that they own, right? And Apple has SK Ad Network and now the ad attribution kit. There's a lot of value in being able to control how people attribute ad spend, especially if you operate a scaled ad network. And so there's a lot of incentive to want to do that. But I think my sense is like they both kind of pushed the limit in different directions, but they both pushed the limit and they're having to like step back those ambitions.
Why would Google do that if their business model is predicated on advertising?
Well, it's predicated on advertising, but not open web advertising. So they make way more money on search and YouTube. I mean, just on a margin basis than they make on network, but now also on an absolute basis. And network is a much smaller proportion of the ads business now than it was 5 years ago. It's 11% now. YouTube makes more money. And so I think they see that as a relic. They just want to drive people into the O&O. And so if they diminish the power of open web attribution, that's one way to do that. But again, now they're preserving cookies. They're not going away. But I still think they have another lever to prevent people from using open web advertising, which is search as a distribution mechanic. And you see what has happened to Google search. When you go to Google and you do a search, you don't get a big list of links anymore.
Yeah, their ad mob piece has got deteriorates as a result.
Yeah, I mean, but that, I mean, I don't know how big that was ever. I mean, my sense is like they kind of capitulated with that 2 years ago when they started routing the Google demand into other mediation platforms, right? So like Max and Level Play. I think once they gave up that real value proposition, because that was historically that was exclusive to AdMob with real-time bidding. The only way to get access to Google demand was to use AdMob as your SSP, and they gave that up, I think, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And so that kind of, to me, made it seem like they weren't really focusing on that anymore.
Christian, you were at one time the number one spender on both Google and Meta, or at least rumored to be. I don't know if I can confirm that one or another. There may
on
be
Meta, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Google top 5 overall.
Sure.
Top
very
one,
close at least.
Top 1 or 2 mobile advertiser.
How did you get around the idea of like the walled garden of attribution?
By doing one thing at a time. So I knew.
I mean, but you're also doing thousands of things. How could you do one thing?
But on the same channel.
Okay.
We didn't get to Android. We had gotten to become a $3 billion GMV business just on Facebook. And it's not because like, wow, imagine if you would have gone elsewhere. We wouldn't have been able to get that big if we would have spent on like 10 places, because we wouldn't have known, we would have introduced so much fraud.
That's fair.
Like we only got good because we did one thing.
I feel like a lot of people fight against that, right? They have so much of a desire to be everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Was this top down, or how were you able to convince, the CEO that you're going to go still all in on one channel and you're like, no, we're going to ignore Google for right now?
It is like thesis driven. It was like,
sure.
We just had like influence coming up with DPA. So, and nobody else was like really able to tap that because no one else had like a product feed. And even if they did, they didn't know that was so beneficial for ads. So they were just uploading like 20, they were doing like things that are not beneficial for ads because they didn't understand that it was very beneficial.
At what point do you guys think that we just say attribution is good enough, move on to better strategy?
For what do you mean?
Just in general, like marketers, marketers are looking at, their GA4 results. They're looking in Shopify. They're looking at Northbeam and Triple Whale, and they're looking at all these they're running the holdout studies. At some point in time, I do feel like there's like an analysis paralysis where nobody wants to make the call and actually just do something. Like at what point do we say, look, the attribution is good enough, just take action, do something?
I think they should be doing that earlier than most do, but I think like Christian makes a good point, and you kind of highlighted it. It's like you can engineer that by focusing on the core channels and not diversifying too early. I mean, I think people make a mistake when they conclude that they need to diversify. Like diversifying will, in and of itself, inherently deliver a lot of efficiency, and that's usually not the case for a number of reasons. One is you develop specialization in the platform that unlocks efficiency. Two, you add a lot of overhead when you onboard new platforms. You've got to do data integrations. You learn how to make different creative styles. That's overhead. That's a drag on efficiency, right? Mm-hmm. And three, like there are a handful of channels that you could rely on exclusively, and if you only rely on those, then your attribution is almost a solved problem. Like you don't even really need a lot of sophisticated modeling. You know where the traffic's coming from. And if you're only on one, which is Facebook, you're probably covering 90% of your TAM anyway.
Yeah. Sure. So you can make it the whole distance with that.
That's fair.
That's my priority. If I'm somewhere that can scale very large, is I don't want to get good at something that cannot scale extremely large.
with
because
stability.
then it's like venture. It's like all these things are barely work. So when it does work, it needs to work massively big.
Yeah, with stability. Again, a lot of efficiency can be found on TikTok for a lot of brands in the e-commerce space, especially. I can't speak outside of that, right? But it could be very high or low. Like it could be very good one week, very bad the next week, and it doesn't feel as stable of a platform from an acquisition standpoint as a lot of like Meta would be or YouTube would be for a lot of things. And so your point, it can scale potentially, but maybe not as stable.
It's hard to control for that piece. The DPA or the performance plus. Like volume kind of helps to control for that. But even when you have volume, say in a game as a game publisher, every new title you don't know necessarily. You can estimate how it's supposed to do, but you don't know how it's going to do. You can't predict very well.
Do you think marketers are too reactive now to all of the different nuances in platform changes as opposed to maybe just leading with strategy, and that maybe sometimes we're trying to fine tune things too much instead of just saying the issue is not the 1% incremental that you can get from this little tweak as much as your product sucks or your landing page sucks. And like, this is the issue you need to actually focus on.
They can't control recreate the product though.
Sure.
Like if they're an enterprise company or, games, like most, like a junior UA manager is not going to have an
sure.
On, hey guys, let's create another product.
That's why I generally advise like startup companies. Like I think the CEO should be running Facebook ads up to like some amount of money. I think you need to prove out the product market fit before you bring a marketing person in. Because like, first of all, it's just really beneficial for the CEO to understand like the mechanics of growth, which, customer acquisition is, and Facebook will be, particularly for like digital first, like app companies. But second, I mean, you need to earn that first marketing hire. You need to earn that first marketing hire with like more work than the CEO could feasibly do because there's so much to optimize on the marketing side because you're growing so much.
I like it.
Yeah, that has a ton of benefits in like being able to communicate to your future growth people, to in your discussions with like investors in the future. I think that's like a massively underexplored thing is the attributing the associating the right amount of value with like being like having some kind of proficiency in that. Like just yesterday actually, all the time I'll see people comment on LinkedIn saying, "Oh, we got this many users with no marketing," and I'll even reply just because it's a fact that, well, you're going to need to market if you want to get bigger than some like alternative in the future, right? If you get like more ambitious, only like the way you get better at it is through volume and repetition intentionally. So like the longer you like, if you don't start, it's just going to take you longer. You're going to be pretty bad for a longer period of time, or it's going to take you. You're not going to get good for a while.
That's true to everything, right? Like you have to take the shots in order to get better. Gary Vee says this even with, running a podcast, for instance, and it's like your first 100 are going to suck, but you don't get to 101 until you do the first 100.
Why are people so excited to not do the 100 then?
Yeah. You have to get over that, right? You have to say like, okay, well then I'm excited to do these first 100 bad things in order to get to the 101st one that's going to be good or better.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I launched my blog, I wrote like 10 articles that I just never published. I just wanted to like get the muscle going. And when I wrote my book, I actually saved the first chapter for last because I knew that was going to be probably the most important chapter in terms of like, convincing people to keep reading. And I knew that like after I wrote 10 chapters, I'd be better, than I was going to be having written 0. And I mean, like, it's just life, right? That's the human growth process. Like, and just kind of, you have to, that's why it's really good to do stuff, that you like, because if it's fun the whole time, then at least you're getting something out of it.
I've never heard anybody write the first chapter last, but I really like that idea and your rationale for doing so.
That's what I think I think people should start their careers in consumer, because that's where you'll get the volume and the pattern recognition and build the muscle and how to do things, and then you switch over to whatever you want. because you'll have have some framework for how funnels work and how channels work and what an A/B test is and why it's helpful and like what you shouldn't count on it solving.
And it's more fun because you get the dopamine hit faster.
I mean, it's not fun to have really high failure rates.
Sure, that's fair.
I mean, consumer is hard and it can be like heartbreaking and defeating, right? But like when you're working on something that people are using, and like the coolest thing for me, I mean, I'm sure you experienced this more often than I did, Christian, but like going on a plane and walking down the aisle and seeing someone playing a game that your company makes. Like that was the coolest feeling, or sitting next to somebody, and they're playing the game that your company. That was just a really, really cool feeling. And
Rovio's next level.
Yeah, that's true. Rovio, I had that sensation more, but like you don't really get that with B2B SaaS. I mean, I guess you'd be sitting next to somebody using Notion or something, but like it was just a really fulfilling feeling. That's the nice thing about working in consumer. It's like you're working on stuff that you yourself might use, or like your friends might use, and someone says, "Oh, you work there? Like you work there? I can't. That's so cool."
It's true for your kids too. I recently had, I've had a lot of really fun guests on the show. I tell my kids about some of the guests that I have, and they're like, "Who? Like, what is that? I don't know anything." But I had Brienne Olsen on here a couple weeks ago, CEO of PacSun, and my kids are like, I've got teenage girls, so like, PacSun, really? Like, I want to watch that episode. I finally got them interested in maybe watching the podcast.
I used to love people at the airport. Those like the people who work there would recognize all the Wish stuff and like talk to me about it. And I used to like that, or cab drivers, barbers.
That recognition. We're running close to time here. I want to end with, let's just say, the future of growth, going beyond like the normal metrics and things like that we're looking at. Christian, specifically, you have talked about how growth leaders need to think more like portfolio managers. How do you evaluate, let's just say, what does that mean? Like to think more like a portfolio manager as a growth marketer?
I don't know about portfolio managers. I think that teams need to be like, the results that I've done has only been from being cross-domain and from like developing a case that's like cross-domain and collaborating with like multiple skill sets. And like if I'm pigeonholed to like only one channel and this one thing, that's like really going to limit what I can do. Like Eric's talking about funnels. He's talking about ChatGPT copy in creative, and like the wider you can pull resources in or to, the more effective you can be. But the narrower you are, then you're only going to find whatever's possible there.
Mm-hmm. What, Eric, what do you think about the future? Like what emerging systems or metrics, or like how do we think about growth in the future, knowing that let's just even say like a lot of what we do is being automated by AI, right? Even a lot of the analyses and things like that. And even the ads platforms within 5 years, a lot of the ads platforms are just going to do significantly more of that without you even having the ability to have manipulation or control over it.
Yeah, but I think most of that's a good thing, right? I think people tend to overestimate their ability to sort of to deliver better performance in the platforms, right? It's like it's kind of like you, in the man versus machine paradigm, you tend to want to root for the man.
Sure.
My sense though is I want to lean into the things that the platform is going to do better than me, and free up that time to do the things that I can do better than a machine, right? Which are probably going to be like the more creative endeavors, like the more creative tasks, right? So I think that's kind of the future of growth. And there's not like some tactic, right? It's just a sense of like, how can I use these tools to the best effect to free me up to go think about things that really drive like value in a fundamental high concept way.
There's also a difference in what something does and what it's supposed to do. Like,
sure.
I think Performance Plus is a good example, or it works really well. Consolidating campaigns works very differently now than years ago. But for years, they would still underperform relative to stuff that was running like very old school style. and there was like no need to rush, switching over because it's supposed to do something, or until you get the feedback that something is outperforming, and then you increase that or scale it up or create some kind of action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. We've talked about a lot of different myths. Is there something that we haven't talked about that you're like, I want to at least make sure that we're talking about this too? And I'll start with you, Christian.
Yeah, I want to touch on something that Eric talked about the systematic. I have a big thing on that also, but the bar is so low to be systematic in growth. I have this opinion that it's like almost like a second rate, separate team that they'll have a different bar of system of like documentation, how they do things. Like think about like the cadence, how much room there is to systematize. Like how many campaigns do you launch every week? How do you come up with ideas? Like how much? How do you start campaigns? How much are you editing them by? When do you edit them? When you have time? By how much? Are you rounding? And all these things, they're like making judgments that are like just very like they don't need to make a decision. And you don't even need to automate it necessarily. It's just systematize it. You can calendarize it. Just like take it off your brain as far as deciding what you're going to do if it works.
That's true for a lot of things, right? To a point that if we could systematize things, we're a lot more effective. The idea of like the 1% a day rule, right? It's just that idea of just.
But like a product engineering, they don't work like that. They're not just like, doing things when they have time and by the X amount that they want or that they kind of feels right.
Yeah. Eric, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just like philosophically, I'm just very allergic to hacks, right? And thankfully, we're post growth hack era. We're in like the post growth hack era, right? Like, I mean, that was just so obnoxious, though. Like now we're in vibe coding, which is probably even worse, and vibe marketing. But like that growth hack era, I think, was just so destructive. Right, from like a good practices standpoint, and like establishing like kind of very very public like best practices, and the reality is like
also.
What's that?
CEO expectations. Some of them would want you to post these things.
How many marketers got fired because they got hired and the CEO was like, oh, I heard about this new growth hack. Why don't you just do that? And we don't need to spend any money on marketing. And 6 weeks later, but I think like systematic thinking. Like the thing is like anytime there are these sort of like apocryphal stories that float around, like, oh, this company grew off the basis of this growth hack, and then you go in and look into how the company actually grew from like 0 to its first million users, and they got like $1 billion worth of free media, right? Because it was just a novel new product idea, right? It wasn't because they did XYZ thing, and then there are too many cases to count of companies that are trying to pull off the sort of like the velvet carpet, like velvet rope growth hack, and like get celebrities onboarded, or I'm going to limit the number of people that can join and drive FOMO. That just doesn't work. I mean, this is just it's kind of boring, and it's supposed to be. Like growing a product should be boring, systematic, kind of slow, very sort of like analytical. If you're experiencing, if you're experiencing sort of like astronomically like high, incredibly fast, uncontrollable organic growth, like you have to plan for when that stops, right? You can't just project that forward, sort of into the future. And so I've always thought the job should just be like almost like a librarian. It's like boring, slow, analytical, and like repeatable and dependable.
Prime Energy drink is a great example of what you just called out too, right? Where it's like absolutely explosive growth, but you're not prepared for when that stops.
Right.
I've absolutely enjoyed talking to you guys. I think that this has been something I've been looking forward to for a few weeks now. If people wanted to follow you or work with you in some way, what is the best way for them to get in touch or follow you? And I'll start with you, Christian.
I'm on X, so at CP Limon, CPLIMON.
Awesome. Eric?
Yeah, I would just say go to mobiledevmemo.com. It's my website. I'm on X, LinkedIn, all those places.
Yeah, cool. I appreciate you guys jumping in here, digging through some interesting myths and how we can hopefully get a little bit more intelligence into the marketing world. It's been fun.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks everybody for listening. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for listening to the Up Arrow podcast with William Harris. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.